Well, hello again, everyone. My name is Mark Johnston. I'm your guest host for Follow the Money Investor Group. And today we have another sit-down opportunity, and we welcome as our guest Ronan Levy, who is the co-founder and executive chairman of Field Trip Health. Ronan, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. And I'm standing right now, not quite a sit down, but ever since the pandemic started, I've made a point of having a stand-up desk because I don't get nearly as much activity. It's amazing how much activity you lose, just like not getting up and going to a different office or, anything along those lines that happen in normal day-to-day life. So anyway, I'm a stand-up person mostly now.
I appreciate that. Well, we're here to talk about the company and the vision of what you're doing as a company and generally where you're positioned in the sector, because the great news for this particular interview is we're exploring a territory that some people will be very unfamiliar with. And I think that's always a great opportunity, Ronan, especially as the person behind the company who's driving the bus, as we say, to be able to speak to an audience honestly and openly about the vision of the company and why you do what you do. So I'm going to start with a very open question for you, which is basically, tell me a bit about the company and what you do.
Sure. So with Field Trip, we launched, it's since evolved, but with the mission to heal the sick and better the well through psychedelics and psychedelic assisted therapies. And what that really means is that psychedelics have such robust potential. And even though for many of us, we learned that psychedelics are these very dangerous, scary drugs in high school and they should be avoided. And there's all these catastrophic things that happen if you take psychedelics. The evidence and the science substantially refutes that. Now, with all drugs, there's always risk involved, but with psychedelics, we're actually seeing the risk profiles to be very, very low and the potential therapeutic implications to be massive. Genuinely game-changing order of magnitude improvements relative to current treatments for depression and anxiety and PTSD and any other host of mental health conditions that we hear about all the time in this world of, we talk about the global mental health crisis. I've heard estimates that 1 in 5 people globally, we're talking about 2 billion people are going to experience a clinically diagnosable instance of depression or anxiety at some point in their lives. The current treatment options just aren't working. And psychedelics really are a platform that I think will change the conversation and actually fundamentally change the course of this crisis that we're experiencing from a mental health perspective and put us on the advantage. And so what we're doing at Field Trip, that was all by way of background, is we're really focused on building the infrastructure to enable this to happen. And that's happening in 2 ways primarily. The first is we are building out the clinical infrastructure to deliver psychedelic assisted therapies at scale. As we can talk about, psychedelics aren't conventional medicine. Psychedelic assisted therapy is not conventional medicine. It doesn't work very well in a hospital setting or a doctor's office, just giving the staffing requirements, what you need from a patient or a client experience, all that kind of stuff. It really needs its own unique space. And so through our Field Trip Health division, we're building out the clinics to actually deliver psychedelic assisted therapies. We've got 7 locations operating across North America right now, working with ketamine assisted therapy, ketamine being an FDA Health Canada approved medicine and using it to treat depression and anxiety and other mental health conditions paired with therapy with incredible results. Expanded, we'll be at 20 locations by the end of the year and then continuing to expand from there. And then the other side of the equation, we're seeing incredible excitement and incredible results with molecules like psilocybin, like MDMA, like DMT and LSD. And these molecules are fantastic, but they're kind of referred to as the classic psychedelics. And so we looked at it and we realized that notwithstanding the potential these drugs have to create great medicines, it doesn't mean we can't do better. And so through our Field Trip Discovery division, we're actually focused on innovating the next generation of psychedelic medicines that can be more tailored or more precise or more affordable than what we're seeing with the classic psychedelics right now. So that's what we're doing at Field Trip. Broadly speaking, heal the sick and better the well through psychedelics and psychedelic assisted therapies. And we're doing that through the clinical infrastructure as well as drug development and drug discovery.
Amazing. Well said and well toured. Thank you very much for that, Ronan. At this point in the journey on the planet, I'm used to working specifically, and this is most of the planet, that you're not feeling well, you go to the doctor, you get a prescription. That's kind of the base foundation that we were all conditioned and grew up knowing. And I've often said, with the greatest respect for modern medicine and pharmaceutical options, you've opened a door here in everything you've just shared, which is, yes, there's that column, There's that camp. There's also this camp over here, which believes in coming at things from a different angle. And, you know, you mentioned words like LSD or ketamine, et cetera, MDMA. Some people might be very drawn into the topic, and some people might be very spooked because it's new territory. And I'm used to going to my doctor, and if I feel a little blue, they give me the orange pill. You know, there's sort of a basic traditional approach when you go to the doctor if you're not feeling well. This offers a different angle. What caught my ear as you shared the choreography of this particular work, Ronan, was that in conjunction with counseling, in conjunction with other modalities. So can we speak a little about that? Because clearly it's an option that people now have in the world and have for a very long time. My understanding, certain cultures, certain traditions have believed in this for a very, very long time. The idea in Western society specifically, that we're used to going to the doctor's office or a counselor's office, and here we have an option that's come into the game, which can work in tandem. So can we talk a bit about that opportunity that these products can also work in conjunction with other healing modalities?
Sure. And in some respects, this is novel and differentiated, and people aren't familiar with it. In other respects, it totally fits within our classical paradigm of Western allopathic medicine. Allopathic medicine meaning you focus on treating what's wrong. And, you know, listen, modern medicine has been a marvel. We've achieved amazing things in terms of human longevity and quality of life and all that kind of stuff. And it was a system that worked well by kind of disaggregating biology, right? And now we have a system where you go to your family doctor and they triage you. If you got a skin problem, you go to a dermatologist, and if you got, you know, a joint problem or a muscle problem, you go to an orthopod and all that kind of stuff. And it's a system that works pretty well. But what we're seeing now is that an integrative approach, looking at the body as a holistic functioning organism or system, seems to be generating even better improvements. And so it's not atypical to go to the doctor and be like, hey, doctor, I pulled my shoulder muscle. And they're like, cool, here are some, you know, pain medicine, and now go to a physiotherapist and do the work that way. That works for our physical bodies, and many people accept that. Most people don't accept that in the mental health sphere. For whatever reason, we've always liked to believe that all that ails your emotional and mental health can be fixed by just modulating the chemicals in your brain. And you know, we're seeing more and more that that's not true. It's an incomplete solution. And what we're seeing with psychedelic assisted therapies, and why we seem to see these really transformative results, is it appears to have at least 3 effects happening simultaneously when you have a psychedelic assisted therapy experience, whether it's with ketamine, which is available now, or with psilocybin and MDMA, which are expected to be approved over the next 2 to 5 years, give or take. Is that, first of all, most classic psychedelics create a significant, very rapid serotonin rush. So people feel like a lift in mood almost immediately. We certainly see with the patients coming through our clinics that, you know, within 20 minutes of receiving the ketamine, their mood is already lifted. So you've got this natural kind of lift. The second piece that happens, and this is where the comment you're kind of focusing on, is we're doing this as psychedelic assisted therapy. And what people often report during a psychedelic experience is the ability to revisit past memories or past traumas or past events, or just see the world in an entirely different perspective that they couldn't have seen before, just given the standard operating procedures of their brain and their mindset and all that kind of stuff. And with that little bit of extra perspective, or that little bit of objectivity to a past event that you may have carried with you for so long, you're able to let go of the emotions around it. This is what conventional cognitive behavioral or talk therapy tries to get at. It's just with cognitive behavioral therapy or talk therapy, it takes a long time to get to that point. And what the psychedelic assistance does is really cut down your emotional walls, break down the ego, and then you can get right to the heart of the matter. So you can move it a lot more quickly than you would in conventional therapy. So you've got first that immediate lift, then you've got this emotional processing on an expedited basis, and that's where the therapy really kicks in. But also the therapy is relevant, and for the third reason we seem to see such profound results is evidence shows that ketamine and psilocybin, the classic psychedelics, cause something called neurogenesis or synaptogenesis, which means your brain actually starts to regrow neural synapses, the cells that make your brain cells talk to each other. And it's believed that creates a period of neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is a term you'll often hear with children. Children are highly neuroplastic, which means they can pick up skills or languages a lot faster than us old folks can because their brains are much more malleable. And what we're seeing is after a psychedelic experience, our old brains, so to speak, get a little bit of that youthful enthusiasm back and are much more adept at adopting new mindsets, new skill sets, new habits, new outlooks. And so as part of that therapeutic process, the other piece of it is taking advantage of that window and enabling people to say like, okay, you know that going to the gym, for a simple example, makes you feel better. You've had trouble finding that motivation. Take advantage of this neuroplastic window and start a new habit about going to the gym, because we know going to the gym makes you feel better and helps you be healthier and all that kind of stuff. Or, you know, start meditating more, or just like take a different perspective. And so you've got this kind of spectrum of things happening. Some of it being neurobiology, but a lot of it being kind of emotional processing or feelings or energies or anything along those lines, things that tend to be called woo-woo, but they seem to be real, you know, they seem to be very real in this conversation. And so that's the importance of pairing it with therapy. That's why psychedelics don't work like SSRIs. You can give someone a psychedelic and be like, here you go, and they'll feel better for a little while. But when you look at the studies that suggest, you know, 2 to 3 MDMA assisted therapy sessions can effectively cure people of chronic severe PTSD, or you look at the studies looking at a single psilocybin assisted therapy session giving people antidepressant effects for 5 years, or even what we're seeing in our clinics, where people after a couple of ketamine assisted therapy sessions will go from severe depression to mild to non-existent depression for months at a time without having to take a single additional pill. You start to understand the power of integrating psychedelic drugs, psychedelic molecules with therapy to create these amazing outcomes.
Remarkable. I mean, that's a lot of what I would say science as a download in terms of the type of work that you do, the products that you work with, and the results that are being seen. I think, you know, especially given what the planet's going through right now, Ronan, we're still going through such a unique phenomenon that we haven't seen in at least a century. And when you talk about the impact, right, whether you're on the side of vaccines, not vaccines, regardless of which side you sit, there's a lot going on for humans today in the world. And we don't have the opportunity to live our life the normal way that we have become accustomed to living. So therefore, the impact of such a pandemic is very present for many of us. So when I think about the opportunity to speak to someone like yourself behind the company brand, you're hearing some of the basic fundamental reasoning for why this type of work works. So a question comes to mind for me, and I'm sure perhaps for a lot of an audience in this area, which is it safe? We've heard some remarkable results that are happening in terms of testing, and I'm sure studies happening before approvals are made. Is it safe would be a natural question for many people. And I wonder if you could speak to that.
So the answer is, contrary to what you may have learned in high school, psychedelic drugs are remarkably safe. That's not to say they're completely safe and you should take them with reckless abandon, not at all. But you look at countless studies across the spectrum, and we see just really eye-opening information. For example, Professor David Nutt, who's a professor at Imperial College in London, and he used to be the chair of the UK's National Council on the Abuse of Drugs, or something along those lines. I may not have the exact name. Essentially, he was the drug czar. He was the person tasked with the UK's drug policy, illicit drug policy. And he brought a science-based approach to that job, which makes sense when you think about the fact that drug use is more of a medical health issue than really a social issue. And he did a study, and it was published in The Economist, where he found that, and he looked at about 30 different drugs, some illicit, some licit, and found that the drugs with the lowest harm profiles were psilocybin, LSD, MDMA, and ketamine. In fact, all of them were rated as having a lower harm profile than cannabis, which in our society is generally regarded as pretty safe, right? So you're seeing this evidence, and you know, it's not actually altogether that surprising, because if you go back to the research that was done in the 50s and 60s, and LSD was one of the most studied drugs on the planet in the 50s and 60s, they found that generally LSD and other tryptamines like psilocybin are non-addictive. In fact, they're anti-addictive, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that they can help people get off other substance abuse disorders.
Wow.
So they're non-addictive. It's virtually impossible to overdose on them. Yes, you can take way too much. Yes, you can make yourself very sick, but the lingering effects are basically non-existent. In fact, there is one case study. Now, admittedly, it's an N of one, so it's just an anecdote, but a woman who took 10,000 micrograms of LSD, which is about 40 times a normal dose. She was sick for a couple of days, no lingering effects, and in fact, reports that that experience cured her bipolar disorder. Now, again,
Wow.
N of one, don't take anything from it, but it shows you that you can take a lot of these drugs and suffer no real ill consequences. The biggest risk associated with psychedelics, which is still a small risk, but it needs to be noted, is the risk of the so-called bad trip, right? That's the, don't do the brown acid. I remember that line in high school. What we seem to know now is that there's no such thing as a bad trip per se. There are easy trips and there are challenging trips. There are easy psychedelic experiences and there are challenging psychedelic experiences. Challenging psychedelic experiences can actually be the most therapeutic. They can be the most cathartic. They can lead to the most significant breakthroughs if they're properly supported, right? A psychedelic experience can turn dark, it can turn scary, but if you have someone there who gives you the reassurance and helps you navigate it, the breakthroughs are potentially amazing, such that you don't have to have a bad trip. Now, if you do have a psychedelic experience and you're not properly supported, then a challenging trip can become a bad trip, and that creates its own consequences. Again, the risks are pretty small, all things considered. It can create its own instance of trauma, but generally speaking, that doesn't happen very often, and the effects tend to be temporary. So yeah, net, we're talking about very safe drugs, and if taking it to a different level of scrutiny, MAPS, which is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, a nonprofit organization in the US, they're the ones conducting the clinical trials on MDMA-assisted therapy, and they've just completed the first part of their phase 3 trial. So they've gone through phase 1, phase 2, and now they're in the first part of phase 3. What they found in that trial was that MDMA-assisted therapy, 3 sessions of MDMA-assisted therapy, cured close to 70% of people with chronic severe PTSD. But importantly, in the conversation of safety, there was not a single reported severe adverse event, which means nobody had a really bad side effect, which is very significant. It's rare that drugs don't have some degree of adverse event, even the safe ones. So you're looking at drugs that are very safe, net.
Well, and the word that I pull out of that, thank you for that, Ronan, is the word therapeutic. That it's a lens, right? I think there's certain preconceptions. I think that you're helping to demystify certain preconceptions, and the word safe is important for many people looking at this sector. I've also certainly explored the company a little bit, Ronan, in advance of our interview. The website's fantastic. The imagery of your clinics, very high-end, professional, quite beautiful. Nature ingredient is rolled into the aesthetic. I mean, you've clearly done a lot of thinking and planning in terms of how the company is front facing, if you would, to the consumer market. So I'd love to ask it a little bit about that, because we're talking about, I feel like we've kind of walked through some of the initial knee-jerk reactions perhaps in an audience. We haven't even touched on the investor side, but I do want to ask a little bit about this too, because the framework that you're offering as a brand and a company is that's very much professionally executed. You have people, an ecosystem of professionals and facilities that are a part of this choreography. This is not somebody at home experimenting. This is very much upscale, professional, tried and true, researched and studied, and now offering a service to the public. So clearly you've come at this with a lot of thought.
Absolutely. Our background, myself and the other co-founders in Field Trip, we were very active in the Canadian medical cannabis industry. And what I think we did very successfully, and I think the impact is still being felt, is we focused on doing cannabis medicine in a way that the medical community could get behind. Right. So that meant that we didn't prescribe to anyone. That meant that we turned away a lot of people who weren't using cannabis therapeutically, at least as far as current guidance went. And what that did is we had a whole bunch of doctors say like, oh, these guys take this seriously. Like I had always imagine cannabis as a joke, but these guys take the medicine seriously. Oh, and I'm seeing really positive results from my patients. And so even though I'm not going to prescribe, I now have a trusted resource where I can say this is working. And what happened is all of these doctors who were highly resistant to cannabis in the first place, not only became not resistant, many of them became advocates because they saw the profound impact that cannabis medicine had on their patients. And again, I went into the cannabis industry entirely skeptical as to therapeutic applications, but I thought philosophically I was all on board, with providing access, because I thought, at least from a political perspective, the war on drugs never made a whole lot of sense to me. What I saw, though, was real impact, real life-changing impact on our patients. And so after we left the cannabis industry and came in, learned what was happening in psychedelics and saw, the kind of natural parallels between stigmatized medicines, politicized medicines, all this kind of stuff. And we learned about the evidence, and we knew that psychedelics were going to need to have that same cleansing of old perspectives. We felt we had a unique qualification to bring that. And I felt personally called for my own personal, therapeutic and coaching work that I've done in my life, and know how much it's impacted me, completely independent of psychedelics. I saw psychedelics as being a platform to really reach a lot of people in ways that, they're otherwise unreachable right now. And we brought that same lens, right? We brought that lens of professionalism, that this has to be doctor, professional, therapeutic, all the things that the medical community can get behind. Because if you get the medical community behind it, then everything falls into place, right? And so that's exactly the lens. Our team is comprised of incredibly experienced psychiatrists, physicians, psychologists, therapists. On our board of directors, we've got pharmaceutical executives of the highest order, some of the most successful pharmaceutical executives. Dieter Wienen used to be the chairman and CEO of Bayer Pharmaceuticals. Michael Ehlers, he's not on our board of directors, he's one of our scientific advisors, was the SVP of R&D, and particularly focused on neuroscience at Biogen. We're talking about some of the largest, most successful pharmaceutical executives out there who are looking at the psychedelic space with an incredibly sophisticated, thoughtful lens. And we need to do all of that. We need that research. We need that horsepower, the intellectual horsepower. We need that experience, because it's hard to develop a new drug, a new medicine, and bring it to market at the best of times. Right. Coming from the lens of psychedelics and all of the stigma and legacy makes it that much harder. And so, yeah, we've certainly focused on doing it professionally, legitimately, scientifically, and trying to leave a lot of the old tropes and stigmas behind so we can have a fresh conversation about this.
Well, I appreciate that tour. And honestly, I can't help but imagine 50 years from now, Ronan, when the industry has excelled and evolved and lifted to a certain level, it's almost pedestrian that it's not only accepted, but celebrated and encouraged, because we are in a place in our evolution on the planet, I think, where we need to be more open to doing things in a different way. Whether you go back to the ancients, I mean, there's some cultures, and I know you know this, on the planet that have studied whether it's herbal or medicinal plant life that is the base for some sort of healing. And here we are in a Western society. You go to a clinic, beautiful, I might add, as we see at Field Trip Health, and you're supported in a very professional way, a very holistic way to experience that journey. So let's move over to the investor side, because this is very helpful for those that may not understand the sector very well. But let's talk, of course, our audience is mainly those that are comprised of people that enjoy researching and digging and finding opportunities for investing that excites them, and then to putting the money behind a company. So for Field Trip Health, let's talk about the financials and the way you've set up the company, and that if I'm going to invest in this company, I feel like I've gotten to know Ronan a bit, the passion for what you do, but on the financial management, cap structure, those sorts of ingredients would be helpful. So just to do a health check on the company and where you're at right now, can you answer some of those questions for those investors that they would probably go to these questions first and foremost to understand? So tell me a bit more about the company from that light.
Sure. So I'll kind of check off some of the basics. So we're a publicly traded company. We're one of 4 psychedelic companies listed on the NASDAQ. We're one of 2 on the global select tier, which is the same tier that Apple and Amazon and Google and all those companies are. So we have been through the ringer in terms of scrutiny, in terms of regulatory perspective. We've got about $100 million in cash. We raised a large fine. We've raised a total of about $150 million, give or take, since inception, which was April 2019. Our last financing brought in some of the most sophisticated biotech and pharma investors out there, which was a great nod to our strategy, because our strategy is a little bit different. Our strategy really pays homage to the idea that this psychedelic assisted therapy, that people who are coming at psychedelics with just that conventional pharma drug development lens aren't really seeing the full equation, because as we talked about at the beginning, we're talking about psychedelic assisted therapy. They go hand in hand. So if you're just focusing on the drug and not the therapy, there's an essential component that you're missing. And we're seeing now some very cautionary tales about not thinking about how medicines actually get rolled out. For example, Spravato, which is a Janssen or J&J product, it's a form of ketamine. It got approved for, I think, treatment-resistant depression. So it is very similar to what we're doing in our clinics with racemic ketamine, but it's a branded product. It's struggling because of the REMS that got associated with it, because of their marketing rollout, because a lot of doctors find it expensive, whereas racemic ketamine is very inexpensive. Same with a product called Zulresso, which got approved for postpartum depression. It's a very long time frame. Most hospitals don't want to do it. It's super expensive, and so we looked at this, and I can't say we looked at it and responded. We actually anticipated this, and now have these kind of data points to validate our strategy that has existed from the beginning. But we really wanted to build that clinical infrastructure as well to support the delivery of psychedelic therapies, not just our own. We're developing our own, but working with ketamine, what the work we're doing right now is enabling us to innovate on the therapeutic protocols that go along with psychedelic therapies, have the conversations with the medical communities and the key opinion leaders, talk to payers, talk to insurers, understand the landscape and what they're looking for in terms of insurance reimbursement, such that when all of our drug development efforts start to come to fruition, there's a clear path to commercialization. So we don't fall prey to the, missteps that Zulresso and esketamine have fallen prey to. So our strategy with Field Trip, our purpose is really to develop new psychedelic therapies. We're definitely working with the classic ones, but where we're really excited is in our drug development work. Our first molecule in development is something called FT104. And the inspiration for FT104 is we looked and we saw just how revolutionary we consider psilocybin to be as a mental health treatment. 2 big limitations with psilocybin. One is the long time frames. A psilocybin experience is 6, 8, 10 hours. It's a long time that you're going to be in a clinic with a doctor and a therapist or 2 therapists and other staff and space, and it's expensive. Whole day of work that's being missed for these therapies and all that kind of stuff. Great medicine. The efficacy is, really quite strong, and we'll see more and more data come out to validate that psilocybin is a great medicine, but it's not necessarily a clinically efficient medicine. So that was one issue with it. Secondly, from an IP perspective, it's well characterized. It's known. Generating IP that's defensible from a business perspective for psilocybin is very challenging. And given the cost of drug development and drug approvals, which are hundreds of millions of dollars, you need that IP really to make a strong, persuasive business case for why people should invest in it. So he said, can we find something that looks like psilocybin, feels like psilocybin, that does the same thing as psilocybin with a shorter duration of action, thus making it much more clinically easy to administer, and for which we can develop IP. I'm shortcutting the conversations, but that was essentially the question. And the answer was yes. And FT104 was born out of that. We canvassed all the known literature. We canvassed all of the anecdotal reports online. We narrowed in on a particular psychedelic, and we haven't disclosed what the psychedelic is. So the underlying psychedelic is still something that we're holding in confidence until our patents come out of the submarine period at the end of the year. But we found this psychedelic molecule that looks and feels and acts in the brain very similar to psilocybin, but has a 2 to 3 hour duration. And that was a known psychedelic, but it had problems from a drug development perspective due to solubility issues and all that kind of stuff. So Dr. Nathan Bryson, our chief science officer, went about doing his chemistry and modified this underlying psychedelic slightly, turning it into a prodrug. So FT104 is a prodrug for this underlying psychedelic, much like psilocybin is a prodrug for psilocin. So psilocin is actually the active molecule in your brain. You take psilocybin, if you ingest psilocybin, your body cleaves off. I think it's a phosphate molecule, but my chemistry skills stopped in grade 11, so bear with me if I'm incorrect on that. And it's psilocin that acts in your brain. So much like that FT104, when it gets administered, your body cleaves off the molecule. We've added that underlying psychedelic, for which there's many known anecdotal trip reports, repopulates itself. And what we've seen is that, in our preclinical studies, it works very much like psilocybin, but with that shorter duration of action. So we're really excited because we're going to benefit from all of the success of psilocybin and then come out with a product that is probably going to be superior, just given its shorter time frame and for which IP is available. And we hope just like replicate that model, right? Because we've got the clinical infrastructure, we can de-risk it. We can, through our clinical infrastructure, we can identify needs in the market. We can see what populations are not being served. We can see what indications are not really being met by, or what diseases are not being met by the current psychedelic paradigm. And then we can inform that into our drug development strategy of like, oh, where are the gaps? Where are the holes? And it becomes this really virtuous cycle of identifying new opportunities, putting it into drug development, de-risking that drug development through innovation in the clinical infrastructure and delivery, packing that back into the drug development. And it really creates this, I think, a really magical, virtuous cycle for the work we're doing.
Wow, that is a remarkable tour inside the company of what happens for some of the heavy lifting that you're doing. FT104, we'll keep an eye out for that. As an investor here, Ronan, so that's a perfect segue, because one of my questions that's still standing for this interview is talk about the entry point for an investor. Where are you? I always like to step back and look at the bird's eye view of a company. We're moving towards the fourth quarter almost for 2021. Where are you as a company today versus even a year ago? And what are some of the key benchmark timeframes or turning points, if you will, or markers at the company that if someone's interested in investing, why is now a good time? And educate us, if you will, as investors that might be new to the sector, to say there's a few key turning points coming and here's what they are. Could you share some of that?
Sure. So, we've been around for about 2.5 years. A year ago, we were still a private company. Our first clinic in Toronto had just opened, and we were just starting to scratch the surface of our drug development strategy. Fast forward a year, we're publicly traded on the NASDAQ. We've got 7 clinics open. We've got another 11 under construction, or 12 under construction, seeing patients. We've already become the largest provider of psychedelic therapies in the world. And our drug development program is just kicking off, and going entirely the right direction. There's a lot of excitement about the work and the strategy behind FT104, to the point where an investor, one of the sophisticated biotech investors that we met with in one of our road shows, said, when we kind of gave them a little bit of insight, was like, this is the best idea I'm going to see all year. And that conversation was in January. So a lot of excitement for the work we're doing. In terms of inflection points, I think it's a great time to invest in Field Trip. When you look at us compared to the other companies listed on the major US exchanges, which are Atai, Compass Pathways, MindMed, and Cybin, we're 1/10 the valuation of Atai, about 1/6 the valuation of Compass Pathways, about the same for MindMed, about half the valuation of Cybin. But I think we actually have the most persuasive drug development program of all the companies out there. We're just a little bit earlier stage because we're still preclinical with FT104 and hope to get into phase 1 clinical trials early next year. That's when you're going to start to see those significant value inflection points, commencement of phase 1, readout of the phase 1 results. And what's nice is Compass Pathways, which is the company leading the work on psilocybin right now, they expect to report their phase 2B clinical studies at the end of this year. So that's going to be a real bellwether. If Compass is successful with their psilocybin trials, that really suggests a lot good fortune and good circumstances for anyone else working with 2A agonists, which is what the receptor that psilocybin works on, which is exactly what FT104 is. FT104 is a 2A agonist. So if Compass is successful, then I think it's going to really just, the whole industry is going to get a lift on that. But I think we're actually going to disproportionately benefit from it, because it's going to suggest that FT104 is going to be effective but superior in so many ways because of its preferred characteristics. So, I see an inflection point once we start phase 1. I see a sooner inflection point when Compass reports its results. And then, certainly as we get into phase 2, which I think we're hoping to get into at the end of next year, you're going to see another value inflection point. But to put it in perspective, companies that are in phase 2 trials of comparable nature, their valuation, this isn't pure, a definitive answer, but you see a lot of companies valued between, call it $1 billion to $3 billion. We're currently trading at a market cap of roughly $300 million. So assuming that there wasn't a catastrophic event in our drug development program, you can expect to see our valuation start to creep up into those comparable ranges over the next 6 months to a year, I imagine.
That's great tapestry and great context, Ronan. Thank you for that. I'd love to ask a bit more about the team, because you go to work every day doing what you do. It's an exciting sector. Some of us don't understand as much as others. And this is a great way for us to feel educated and brought up to speed on what's happening inside the company. But you must have a pretty remarkable team behind you because of the nature of the type of work that you're doing. It's innovative and we're moving in a certain direction. Again, I always look 50 years from now. Can you imagine where the industry is going to be? This is today, it's early stages, and often investors are looking for opportunities to get in at an earlier point. So you mentioned some of the players, but just generally speaking, when you go to work every day, tell me about the dream team that you're working with.
Sure. And just before I do that, just talking about like people getting excited, investors getting excited. There's a lot of investor excitement around cannabis, right? And it ebbed and flowed and all that kind of stuff, but there's still an incredible amount of excitement about that potential. I genuinely believe that the potential of the psychedelic industry dwarfs the potential of the cannabis industry, because by and large, the cannabis industry is an industry for cannabis consumers, right? There's an existing market. Some people are going to start to come into it for sure, and it's going to grow, but it's kind of a standalone industry. Yes, there are medical applications, there's a lot of research, but by and large, it exists by itself. When you're talking about the psychedelics industry, we're not talking about psychedelic users. We're not developing products for psychedelic users like cannabis industry is building products for cannabis users. We're building mental health treatments. We're looking to service the 2 billion people that are going to experience a mental health issue at some point in their lives. Many of those multiple mental health challenges. Truthfully, everybody experiences mental health challenges at some point in their lives. We're just not very good as a society at providing the right support for that kind of care yet. So you think about the scale of that opportunity, which is in the hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars, you start to understand why I'm so much more excited about psychedelics than cannabis. And I was really excited about cannabis in the first place. In terms of the dream team, the founders of Field Trip, we've all worked together for 7 years or so. We were all very actively involved in the cannabis industry, and through the trials and tribulations of the cannabis industry, we're still good friends and we still work really well together. And we've managed to create a remarkable team. One of the things that you'll find as people start to wade into exploring the psychedelics industry is that there are a lot of people who have had very positive experiences, either directly or indirectly, with psychedelics, and they become advocates almost immediately. And so, our investor base, our employee base are all people who have been touched directly or indirectly by psychedelics and have I would say, quite literally, a burning passion to see these medicines become accessible to more people. And so, beyond the founders and our board, I touched on Dieter Winan. We've got Helen Boudreau, who used to be the COO of the Bill and Melinda Gates Research Foundation. We've got Alan Lubman, who is the chief business officer of one of the most exciting biotechs out there, Werewolf Therapeutics, in terms of the cancer space, and Barry Fishman, who was very active in the pharmaceutical industry and the cannabis industry. So we've got a great board. I think it will continue to get better. We've got a great investor base, as I've touched on. We have people who are in for the long term, see the potential of our work and the evolution of the industry, and our staff across the board. I think Dr. Bryson is a gem. You know, we couldn't have asked for someone who was so willing to dive into like truly a scrappy startup kind of model. Like we were a scrappy startup. We weren't like conventional classic pharma biotech ivory towers. We were like in the trenches, and Nathan came in and he got into the trenches with us, getting his hands dirty, building chairs, all that kind of stuff. And
Wow.
you know, God bless him for being, you know, willing to take that kind of leap, because you know, all the caliber of chief science officers that we interviewed for that role were just mind blowing. You know, we had chief science officers for globally leading pharma companies who are interested in working with us, but ultimately Nathan was the guy for us because he just had the same ethic. He didn't need, you know, a team of researchers to execute. He was doing it himself. And yeah, and then you know, Ben Medrano, Dr. Ben Medrano, he's our medical director and our SVP for clinical operations in the US. And you know, never met a doctor who is so thoughtful, knowledgeable, yet willing to be innovative or proven wrong. And so he started from a very conservative perspective, and the more work we do, the more he sees patient outcomes, the more he reads, the more comfortable he gets with really starting to challenge some of the conventionally held notions that we have about psychiatry and mental health, and who's an appropriate patient and how they should be treated and all that kind of stuff. And so it really is a remarkable team. We're at about 150 employees right now, and growing rapidly. So pretty good growth for a company that's just about 2 years old.
Well, and it's looking good from everything I've seen research-wise in terms of how you present yourself, as you say, for that front-facing persona of the company, and as you say, clinics under development as we speak. So clearly there's a growth factor happening within the brand of Field Trip Health. I appreciate that. Yeah. I think, Ronan, we've given the audience a very well-rounded, you've offered a very well-rounded insight to how the company operates, what you do, and the potential. I always like to end off with, is there anything that we've missed or something else that comes to mind that you feel really called to share with our audience?
The one thing I always like to bring to mind is psychedelic and psychedelic therapies are really talked about right now in the context of treating depression, treating treatment-resistant depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and they're wonderful. And don't get me wrong, there's nothing negative about that. But what often gets left out of the conversation, I think it's really meaningful, is that if you look at the evidence around psychedelic therapies, people who have psychedelic therapy experiences also report not only significant improvements in their mental health according to all sorts of objective criteria, they also tend to report an increase in empathy and compassion and creativity and openness to other people's viewpoints and concern for the planet. So not only are we talking about addressing the mental health issue, the economic consequences are absolutely mind-blowing. You know, there's one study looking at the global burden of disease that suggests that depression and anxiety disorders are going to be the leading global burden of disease, which means they cost the global economy more than any other disease out there, from out-of-pocket spend, but mostly from lost productivity. You know, people missing work, people not being as productive at work. It's estimated, I think the numbers around, it costs the global economy around $8 trillion annually.
Wow. I mean, even just not being there for your, you know, for parenting, not being present enough for your kids, the applications go on and on, I'm sure.
That's exactly it. So while we get caught up in talking about treating mental health, what we're not talking about is the economic considerations of what that does and the societal considerations of what that does. And these are things we're just not valuing right now that we should be valuing, because when you think about where the demand is going to be and what the impact is going to be, the impact is going to be enormous from the success of psychedelic therapies. It's just, I every day I stop and think about trying to calculate what the real impact is. And it's so much bigger than just depression and anxiety, that, you know, anybody watching the space should be incredibly excited. And whether it's Field Trip or Compass Pathways or any of the other companies kind of participating in the space, it is worthwhile to get behind it, because I really believe so much good can come of this. And we've got 60 years of stigma and legacy to kind of shake off, but it's important that we do it. And I'm not just saying that because I stand to benefit from it, because I do, and I'll acknowledge that. But you know, we got into this space, you know, people said, early on when you'd start looking at the data, and people are like, well, if they're so successful, are you going to potentially put yourself out of business by treating depression and curing depression? And we've always said, if we cure depression,
Hey,
and we put ourselves out of business, that is something that we can totally live with. But the
yeah,
truth of the matter is, like, it's not reflective of reality, right? Which is
sure.
like, causes of depression happen every day: car accidents, family members dies, divorce, lost job. Like, life goes on. You're never going to cure depression, because depression is a function of the human existence,
Sure.
but the more we can ease it, the more we can create resilience, the more we can give people the skill sets and equip them to ride with the punches that life inevitably throws your way,
Mm.
we're going to do a great service for this world. And so that's what gets me out of bed every day. Building field trips, certainly, but really it's that bigger mission in mind that keeps me going.
Wow, Ronan, what a great note to end this on. It's you speak with beauty, and I think that for investors, the opportunity here, and in many other cases, but certainly here, what seems to me the opportunity to become involved in a vision that will change the world, not only for people looking to invest and have more abundance, but you're actually making an impact in the world. And especially with what's going on the planet today, I think there's only good things that may come with that. So it's all about potential. I think you've shared really wonderful key points for our audience to hear. And I want to thank you for bringing all you have forward, because the world needs new hope. And I appreciate seeing it from an investor perspective as well. So thanks so much for your time, Ronan. Appreciate it.
Thank you for your interest. I really appreciate the opportunity.
All right. All the best.